Hi everybody, I am going to do my best at recording a presentation for our greater glider, Burnett, saving greater glider in the Burnett program that we had with BCCA. My name is Misty Neilson. I'm an ecologist and a conservation biologist. I did this project with Burentt Catchment Care Association, and I also work for an organisation called Forever Wild that is looking at protecting some of our last wild places and is heavily involved in how conservation finance and green investment can help make that happen. But today is about greater gliders. So I will go through a presentation. This is an old presentation that we used at the beginning of our program, which is now concluded. It was actually a very small project, didn't have a lot of money, but it aimed to do some pretty big things in terms of habitat enhancement. So I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible because I know that we're on a bit of a time limit today and I don't want to bore you. The project, I will do some acknowledgements though. The project was funded by WISE National Grants Program and was also financially contributed to by Evolution Mining. It was proudly supported by the Australian Men's Shed that created the nesting boxes that we used in the program as well. They didn't support the carved living hollows. That was somebody else, but Gundagun Pastoral Company also supported the project. Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, Accounting for Nature, and Safe Haven. This was one of the greater gliders in the Burentt that was captured at one of the sites, the habitat enhancement sites. This looks like a dead tree, but it's not. This is actually a dead hollow within a living tree, and we'll get into a little bit more about what that means later. But this is a white greater glider. They're not all white. They come in a whole range of colors, but this one was pretty cool. So greater glider flax, you probably know a lot of this already, but they are the world's largest gliding marsupial and second largest gliding mammal. The largest is a gliding squirrel. We come in a pretty close second. They can glide up to 100 meters, and they are more closely related to ringtail possums than they are other gliders. They can grow up to approximately a meter in length, weigh 1.7 kilos in weight, which is not a lot given how long they are, and they come in a range of colours. They are hollow dependent and nocturnal. They are also feeding specialists, feeding on eucalyptus, amongst other things. We'll get into that later, but they're very similar in diet to koalas. Their populations have decreased by 80% over the last 2 decades, which has led to them being listed as endangered to extinction. Why do they need hollows? Hollows are used by greater gliders as nighttime dens for reproduction and protection from their greatest predator, which happens to be the powerful owl. Greater gliders are known. I'll just bring up that this little fella here, he's already got a nice little prey that is picked out of the trees the night before. But greater gliders are known to have relatively small home ranges. They only have home ranges of 1 to 9 hectares, depending on how many dens are within that home range. But they have been known to have up to 20 dens in their home range that they use on a random rotational basis. And this is presumably to evade powerful owls who are known to stake out the hollows waiting for the greater glider to come back. So they often don't return to the same hollow, very rarely. So the more hollows that they have, the safer they are from their predators. Greater glider habitat. Now, this is about the Burnett area. So research suggests that they prefer ironbark forests in the Burnett, but this might be because there are more hollows, not necessarily because they prefer eating it. In the Burnett, the ironbark forests and the poplar box do tend to have a lot more hollows and just because they do. So they tend to have a lot more arboreal, hollow-dependent arboreals living within those forests. Greater gliders do occupy eucalyptus forests and open woodlands and gum top box forests, providing there is enough nesting habitat. That is their most limiting factor, is den sites. They are hollow dependent, no hollows, no greater gliders. No information on what they prefer to eat in the Burnett is currently available. However, in other areas, their preferential feeding species are spotted gum, pink bloodwood, narrow-leafed ironbark, and red gum, amongst other things. Bushfires, food and housing. So this particular presentation was targeted at pastoralists particularly, but it applies to any managed landscape, including state forests. Bushfires being one of the greatest threats to a lot of native species. If they are hot enough, they will denude a landscape, and we've seen that through some of the bushfires that we've had in Australia in recent years. They will heat the soil to depth, and they increase the weeds and decrease preferred species diversity when they are very hot. Bushfires also increase native animals and livestock's vulnerability to starvation and predation. A lot of state forests are leasehold and they do have grazing cattle in there, so this does apply to them as well. I'm not sure if it applies in your particular context, but presumably there would be private landscapes surrounding and bordering the state forest that bushfires do affect. And you want them to be able to increase and keep their biodiversity and canopy species for greater gliders as well, creating that buffer zone between the border of the state forest and private lands. If it's hot enough, it will destroy old trees, living and dead, and therefore the nesting habitat of which greater gliders depend on. Cultural and cool burns often have the benefit of reducing the fuel load and removing woody weeds and pest species, but without killing the canopy species and the habitat trees that greater gliders depend on. They can improve pasture and maintain the integrity of large trees and canopy cover, which is essential for greater gliders. As I said, this presentation was initially created for pastoralists, but again, it applies to managed landscapes such as state forests. So cool burns can reduce risk of bushfires, increase the ground cover and other preferential species. As well as a lot of native species require bushfires in order to germinate, and that's pretty common knowledge. So the research suggests that greater gliders prefer habitat of hills and ridge tops away from riparian zones and waterways. Our observations in field during monitoring would suggest that they hang out there too. Since doing this project and doing a lot of on-ground monitoring, I would suggest don't ride off riparian zones and water bodies or the vegetation around them, because we have observed plenty of greater gliders around these areas. Those trees also tend to have more new growth and shoots that greater gliders prefer, presumably because they have better access to water, particularly in the dry seasons. Greater gliders do tend to obtain all their water from their diet and presumably can't swim. So they haven't actually ever been observed flying over water bodies. And that's probably to avoid risk of getting in the water. It doesn't mean they don't, but they haven't been observed doing it. And it also lessens their need and desire to be near water if they don't need to drink it. Much like koalas, though, koalas will drink from water bodies. Greater gliders have not been observed doing that. They are highly solitary and they can live up to 15 years. They typically only share den spaces during the breeding season, but if there is a lack of den spaces, they will share a den site, a hollow, or a nesting box, both with their own species and others. That's usually a telltale sign that there isn't enough den sites within the habitat. They do not reproduce every season though, and this slows their breeding and conservation and recovery efforts. So every breeding season that they do breed, it is really, really important that that young lives to become a reproductive adult. So they fly with their elbows out, Most gliders will have the gliding membrane that attaches to their wrists. These guys don't. They have it attaching to their elbows. And that may be because they're more closely related to ringtail possums than they are other gliders. However, it attaches to their elbows. They tuck their wrists up underneath their chin and they use their elbows to maneuver in flight. They are highly maneuverable in flight and they're capable of complete 90-degree turns mid-flight and can glide up to 100 meters between trees in a single session. This is not a great clear photo, but you can see where he's got his little hands tucked up underneath his chin here, and these are his elbows up around here. So should you restore or retain habitat? A lot of state and Crown land, obviously along with private land, has disturbed areas in it. And if you're looking at restoring or retaining habitat, what should you do? Well, it's obviously much easier and cheaper to manage and protect and retain habitat. But old hollow trees are not ideal for timber harvesting. So where we've still got state forests that are being harvested for timber or private landscapes that are harvesting for timber, these old gnarled hollowed trees are not ideal for timber harvesting. So if they can be retained and protected during the harvesting process, that is awesome. That's the best outcome. And they can really exist, these kinds of trees can really exist well in grazing production systems, as well as being seed trees in private forestry harvesting systems. They can be the parent seeds for the new seedlings coming up. Old trees provide shade, biodiversity, and fertility values while maintaining critical habitat for native species such as bird and gliders. Regrowth is obviously easier and cheaper than restoring, but supplementary planting may boost efforts where natural germination is limited in number or in species diversity. You also want to encourage sub-canopy regeneration because this helps create microclimates that are much cooler, particularly during the hot seasons, and that can make the environment much more conducive to populations of all kinds of animals, but also greater gliders, particularly when they're vulnerable to heat stress. Hollows, as discussed before, hollows are the greatest limiting factor in greater glider abundance, but are nesting boxes a good alternative? If there's a housing shortage in your local greater glider community, strategically placed nesting boxes can provide really good, suitable, short-term alternative, but they will only last up to 10 years. So you need to have a long-term plan in terms of recruitment of hollows. But in saying that, that can take up to 100 years, and nesting boxes can help fill that gap while they are in development. Another more permanent option, which I'll take you through, which was part of this particular project, was having living hollows professionally carved into large trees by an arborist. The ones that we had carved in were in regrowth forests that were of considerable size, but weren't of the age to be able to have hollows naturally within them yet. And while they will last the life of the tree, depending on the species, but presumably greater than 100 years, they are more expensive to install. But they may be an alternative if you want to learn how to climb trees and learn how to wield a chainsaw and be an arborist and cut them in. Maybe. I'm not advocating for that. But otherwise, you can pay someone to do it. What species should you encourage? The answer is not just eucalypts. Biodiversity is essential for all ecosystems and the fertility of that ecosystem. Encouraging what existed prior to disturbance is really important. And on the BCCA website, I've provided these links to maps as well. We have a link to the Queensland Government website in our guide. And greater gliders prefer to eat young leaves of eucalypts because they're high in nitrogen and they're really low in fiber. So well, comparatively, so they're easier to digest. However, they are also known to eat buds and flowers of eucalypts, the young cones of, I can't pronounce it, pines, you can read it there, wattle leaves, which are actually not true leaves, they're modified stems of various species, and mistletoe. So they eat quite a variety. So variety is really key, and we have some planting tips in our guide. I've provided that link to Max, and you need to have considerations for trees being within gliding distance, particularly large canopy trees that they can glide at to from height. As I said, this presentation was targeted at landholders, so those that we were trying to encourage conservation of threatened species of within viable agricultural landscapes, of which greater gliders are one of these threatened species. But even if you're in a state forest or some managed landscape, presumably you are going to be surrounded by private landholders. So the more that you can encourage them into conservation, the more that you can increase that habitat within the state or the protected area, state forest, national park, or any kind of conservation area. And you can increase corridors between those areas if you can also encourage private landholders that are bordering and surrounding it. The way biodiversity works in terms of fertility within any system, including a production system, is that the more biodiversity that you have, the more different critters and animals, birds, arboreals, ground dwelling animals, as well as insects and reptiles and amphibians. And the more that they poo and they wee and they die and they live and they give birth and they add more fertility to the system during their life cycle that you'll otherwise get in a monoculture or in a less biodiverse landscape. This can have real value to fertility and production within agricultural landscapes, and obviously also within conservation landscapes such as state forests and national parks, or even private conservation areas. So I'm going to go through the benefits to agriculture, because you may be interested in encouraging conservation and retention of habitat trees or restoration of environments within neighbouring properties that border the area that you are trying to conserve. So restoration and retention of habitat trees also assists erosion control, steam bank stabilisation, improve water quality and other natural capital values. It provides shade for livestock. It improves soil fertility and moisture retention for pasture growth. Cicadas are great for this because they are tree dependent. If you don't have trees, you don't have cicadas. Cicadas in their nymph part of their life cycle live entirely underground, and they stay there for a number of years depending on the species. And when they emerge en masse. They also wee and poo and die en masse, and they add fertility to landscapes. So cicadas is often an example that I use for farmers to encourage and retain trees within their landscape, and this adds to soil fertility. They're also doing this under the ground before they emerge. But with the retention of habitat trees, you have more pollinators for cropping and horticulture, so not just pastoralists. You have carbon sequestration, carbon co-benefits, and biodiversity markets, which are basically emerging markets that can all add financial co-benefits to restoring landscapes. Now, fencing is a really important one. So glider-friendly and cattle-proof fencing. Barbed wire is necessary for grazing production systems. So whether the state forest has leaseholds that have fencing within the state forest, or whether this is bordering the state forest, national park, or conservation area, it's highly likely that there's going to be areas where barbed wire is involved. Cattle have little respect for plain wire unless it's electrified, and that's not always financially or practically viable. But barbed wire can be lethal to gliders. One of the alternatives to that is plain top wire. 2 top wires is better because they can flip on the first one and get themselves hooked up on the second one. But one plain top wire is much better than none or having a barbed wire. It can dramatically improve glider injuries and fatalities without compromising the effect on cattle with the remaining barbed wire runs. It's obviously more economic to do it during construction than it is to retrofit it into a fence that already exists. However, if you're keen and you're working in the area and you've got time and money on your hands, then replacing that plain top wire can be a really good alternative. You need to prioritise treed fence lines, though. Obviously, open pasture areas are not a priority. Treed fence lines and corridors are of the highest priority. Gliders are more vulnerable to entanglement along movement corridors and forested areas, and these should be the priority for your fencing zones for replacing that plain top wire. So now I'll go into how spotlighting greater gliders. I'm sure a lot of you have gone out and done it, and from what I understand, there has been a bit of work down there with citizen scientists looking for greater gliders, but I'll go through it anyway. So spotlighting is to see the eye shine from the treetops, and greater gliders are really quite unique in the way that they do that, and they're easy to spot for that reason. They have white, yellow, and up to bright orange eye shine. They're really you can easily spot them. But once you do go spotlighting, don't continue to shine in their eyes. You know what it's like if you have a spotlight shined in your eyes. Use a dimmer after you've spotted them. Swap it out for a duller torch light if possible, or use a red filter once you've spotted the gliders. Nights of little to low moon while focusing on high branches of oldest trees is often also useful. And this is what the little guys look like. They don't move around much. They're unlikely to run away from you. Once they've been spotted, they'll often just stay still and do very little movement. So they'll sit there and they'll just stare at you, which is another reason why you don't continue to shine it in their eyes. You can also stag watch and use wildlife cameras, which is something that we did during the program. So you stake out suspected dens, hollows, nesting boxes of old trees on dusk. Do not shine your spotlight directly at the hollow, because they will avoid emerging until they're satisfied you're gone. So just watch it. Try not to shine it directly. They want to know that it's really dark and that there's nobody about, because remember, they're trying to avoid powerful owls who just yum, yum, yum them up, and then that's it. Remain silent and continue for at least 1 hour after sunset. Longer the better. Place your wildlife, if you're going to use wildlife cameras, place your wildlife cameras at nesting boxes or suspected den sites. Remember, it can take a while for gliders to feel comfortable with a new nesting box, so be patient. Go back and check every couple of months, if not every couple of weeks. You may also wish to occasionally use lures such as real Canadian maple syrup. Greater gliders, actually a lot of gliders, tend to be a bit toffee. They will only like the real Canadian maple syrup, not the fake stuff. So you're going to have to invest in the good stuff. And you can use it on a platform. So you can drill a platform and set a camera up there to see if they come down and visit the station, but don't use it as a continual feeding station. That's something that they get used to. Just use it for monitoring occasionally. This is one of the setups that we used during our monitoring. So this one was a platform that was put in by the landholder with a little bit of maple syrup dribbled on the top, and we had one of these wildlife cameras set up on the tree facing directly. We also had a lot of cameras set up around the boxes, and although we have a lot of data on the habitat enhancement we used, and we do know that they're being used And we do have, they are being inhabited by both greater gliders and a lot of other glider species, as well as possums and birds. I can't give you any statistics exactly on how many different individuals are utilizing the dens that we put in, or how many are using them successfully during breeding season. So how many offspring utilize those dens during breeding season. I don't have the data on that. Nesting box alternatives. Habitat retention is easier and cheaper than restoration and more time efficient. And natural hollows are naturally thermal regulating and last over 100 years. Nesting boxes, as I discussed before, are a good temporary option. Mounting fallen hollow trees, hollows in trees is also an option. So if you ever have any hollows on the ground, mount them up in the trees. The higher the better. But if you can only get up so far, then that's better than nothing. And they will use it. They just prefer high. Having a licensed professional arborist install hollows into established living trees that will also last the life of the tree, potentially many hundreds of years. But it is a lot more expensive. So here is some of the hollows that we had put in during the program. As you can see, these particular trees are, they're in regrowth forest, but they're definitely not old enough to have naturally occurring hollows of their own. They would so the arborist would remove a back plate, and then they would chisel a hollow into the center deadwood, and again off the deadwood off the back of the back plate. They would create an entry, and the size of these hollows were very much dependent on the size of the branches. So this one here is out of a forked tree. They would cut the top off to take the weight away because we now have a very weak part of the branch, and then they would create these hollows, and often multiple hollows within a branch. The larger the tree was, or the larger the branch it was, the larger the den sites that could be created. These aren't great photos. Don't know what's happened there, but these are some of the trees. I can't, yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but these are some of the trees in the regrowth forests that we put den sites in. And I can let you know, like I can give you data that they have been used and by greater gliders as well as other glider species. I just can't give you the specifics of how many individuals within a range or those sorts of statistics. We just didn't have the money to do the monitoring on that, which is, if I could get a wish, it would be to do that and really get the data on it. Would be amazing. We also installed nesting boxes. These ones were created by the Men's Shed, and they use recycled materials. They're a great alternative, particularly for landholders or community groups, because it's something that they can achieve themselves. You can see here that wire was used, hosing was used around the wire to prevent cutting in onto the tree. But these nesting boxes have also been utilised quite well. They aren't as good thermal regulators as trees or hollows within living trees, but they are a really good alternative. And there is something that's duplicatable and achievable, like I said, by landholders or community groups. And that's the end of that presentation. What I would like to do is quickly show you the report that we did for this project. I'm not going to go through it entirely, but what you can do is look at our website. Again, I've given the links to Max, and read all the details of the project in its entirety. But we did go through this project. I'll take you through the report really quickly. It was really focused on conservation in production systems, but it is also applicable to any managed landscape, including conservation areas. And we went through the Burentt greater gliders in the Burentt region. This guy, he was rescued during a bushfire. So there was really old tree that went down during one of the bushfires, and he was trapped inside the hollow as it came down, and it smashed and he was trapped in there, and Mum was out but trying to get back into him, so he was rescued and placed back with Mum, and they ran up another nearby tree, which was also quite old and full of hollows, which was great. We go through the program. We go through the program activities and our habitat enhancement activities. So we covered 8,080 hectares. Obviously, we didn't do all of that habitat enhancement. We picked 11 sites across those properties of 8,000 hectares, and we created 69 den sites within those 11 locations. We did workshops and events, and we also did a presentation in Canberra. We did online and YouTube. You can check out the BCCA YouTube channel and see the recording that we did then. We went through the monitoring. So we also had a collaboration with UQ University, where we helped with trialling their air DNA filtering system, and we're particularly looking for greater gliders. So you can read this report and see what species were picked up at the different, we only did it across 5 locations, 5 sites, but you can pick up you can read about the species that were discovered during that. So it's really early stages in the research at the moment, but it was really cool to trial it through the program. We also we did some community observation records, which in the report you can link to the program's observation records that are held in iNaturalist. I believe I've also sent the link to Max if you're interested in that. We had a community education campaigns. There's some statistics and the different activities we did in that. And then we go through the key findings and results. And I won't go through that here, but you can go through and read all of that, the likelihood of seeing a greater glider based on the community observation records. Just go back here. This is what one of these hollows looked like. So before I said how they chopped the top off, that's what I mean. They were chopping the top off there, just to lessen the weight that's held above so that it didn't break off at the weak point that was now this den site. This is all the hollows that were created and the nesting boxes and the different sites. We also did a habitat enhancement on a mining rehabilitation site, which was really cool. In that one, we put in 10 trees were enhanced within that area. We did 9 of the hollows were installed and 1 of the nesting boxes. And this is the area that we covered. So this is a number of conjoined or neighbouring properties here. This is the mining site there, the mining rehab site, and these were other properties. A lot of these were bordering protected landscapes. This is Cominga Forest here. This is another state forest there. And this is a wildlife corridor between the state forest and the private property. This is the results from the eDNA trial sites. And then we go through the discussion on what all those results meant. And all of these photos, or the majority of these photos, were captured during the program by citizen scientists. And then we go on to what at least the Burentt greater gliders need now. And we went through, we really need population surveys and habitat monitoring over time. There currently exists none of that in most of the state. So if you have the opportunity to set up replicatable monitoring sites over time in your group, that would be amazing and really valuable in adding data. Community-led habitat restoration obviously is really important. It covers a whole lot more land than is currently managed by state or federal monies. Threat reduction, both within the landscape that you're conserving as well as bordering neighbours, and community engagement, and that includes education. And then we just go through a little bit more of that. And we have a conclusion, and there's also a list of references for further reading if you're interested in it. And that is the end. I'll stop sharing. I hope that was useful, and I hope I didn't cover too much of the same information that you already know, because I know you guys are doing some great work. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there with you today. I hope that the links that I've given Max is going to be useful. Feel free to print any of that material from the BCCA website. Next time you have an event, I really hope that I am able to make it. And have a great day. Thank you.